Industrial leases don't hurt you on day one. They hurt you 6 months later when the numbers change and the lease says you agreed to that. There's always a moment before that when something feels just a little bit off and you can't explain it. But most people push past that feeling, and that's the moment that matters. It decides how this all ends. I'm Susan, that commercial realtor. I help industrial tenants, landlords, and investors across Burlington and Halton structure leases that work once operations begin. The right lease doesn't just protect you, it protects the work you've done to get here. And if you're evaluating industrial real estate in this area, that's what this channel is for. It shows you how these agreements function before they turn into expensive lessons. Most leases feel harmless when you sign them. That's part of the problem. You're focused on the deal while a lease decides the rules by which you live. The day it's signed, that document takes over. Not your memory, not a handshake. So let's walk through the parts that decide whether this lease works for your business or quietly against it. One of the most misunderstood parts of any lease are the operating costs that can be referred to as TMI, CAM, TNO. They aren't just a number, they're a definition, and that definition decides what you pay every year. And what matters inside of a lease is what qualifies as operating costs, whether capital repairs are included, how management fees are calculated, and how costs are allocated across tenants. In older Burlington industrial buildings, this does matter. There could be roof replacement, parking lot work, mechanical upgrades, and depending on the lease, those costs can flow directly to you. What I want to look for are vague or overly broad definitions, capital expenditures pass through without limits, and no audit rights. These matter because the net rent stays still, these costs don't, and that's how leases hide movement. So we've defined what you're going to pay. Now let's look at what you might end up fixing. Repair and maintenance obligations. This is where tenants quietly take on more than they expect. You think you're just maintaining the space, but the lease may say you're rebuilding parts of it. The difference between repair and replace isn't wording, it's tens of thousands of dollars. Budgets don't break, they bleed slowly if no one catches it early. Many industrial leases are net leases, which means the tenant carries a large portion of the building responsibility. The question is how much? So what we need to know is who's responsible for the roof, or the structure, or the HVAC systems, or parking and exterior areas. Some leases push this further than tenants realize. What we want to look for are tenant responsible for all repairs language, no distinction between maintenance and replacement, and structural responsibility shifted to the tenant. These all matter because maintenance is manageable, replacement is expensive. That's where budgets start to slip, especially if no one catches this early. So we know what you might be responsible to fix. Let's look at whether the building can even support your business as it grows. I'm talking about utilities and power now. This is not about what exists today. It's about what happens when your needs change. Power constraints in Burlington, they're real, especially in older industrial pockets. What matters inside of a lease? Confirmation of existing capacity, metering structure, ability to upgrade, who pays for upgrades. And what we're looking for is no obligation on the landlord to support those upgrades, no timeline commitment, costs entirely pushed to the tenant. These matter because your business doesn't stop growing because the building does. The lease needs to account for that. Well, if the building can't keep up with your business, you need a way out, and this is the assignment and sublease clause. It's your escape route or your cage. Whether you outgrow the space, scale down, or the building simply stops working for your operation, this clause determines what options you have left. Most tenants don't think about it until they need it, and by then, well, it's already defined. Items like landlord consent requirements, if consent can be withheld, recapture rights, and did you know you can profit share on subleases? You can. What to look for? Sole discretion language from the landlord, recapture clauses that block your flexibility, and profit sharing that cuts your upside. What we want to aim for is consent to not be unreasonably withheld or delayed, a clear response timeline, and the right to assign or sublet part or all to affiliates without consent. This clause doesn't matter until it really does. Then it matters more than the rent. Even if you negotiate flexibility, there's still a place where costs hide. Industrial leases often include a catch-all for additional rent or other charges. It sounds harmless. It absolutely is not. It's where everything else ends up when someone can't find a better place for it. What can show up here are admin fees, management fees, compliance costs, unexpected pass-through expenses. What you want to look for is open-ended language, undefined categories, no caps or limitations. So let's guess why this matters. Anything labeled additional rent becomes legally enforceable rent. This is what tells you what happens when you can't keep up, the default and remedies clause. This section no one really reads until something goes wrong, and this defines what happens if you're late on rent, you breach the lease, your business hits a rough patch. So you're going to want to know about cure periods, landlord remedies, acceleration of rent, re-entry rights. What we want to look for are very short cure periods, immediate default triggers, and aggressive landlord remedies. This clause controls your downside risk, not your upside. Even if everything goes right, there's still one last cost waiting at the end of your lease. I'm talking about the make good or restoration clause, and this one gets overlooked many times. It decides what condition the space must be in when you give it back. In many industrial leases, that standard can be higher than tenants have expected. We need to define what original condition means, whether landlord-approved improvements must be removed, who pays for restoration, and timing of the work before surrender. Things to look for: a broad return to base building condition language, no distinction between damage and improvement, and full removal obligations regardless of landlord approval. Of course, we want to modify it to landlord-approved improvements remain, restoration limited to damage, not upgrades, and a clear definition of reasonable wear and tear. You invested to make this space work, and then you're paying again to undo it. That's the last invoice most tenants never see coming. So now you've seen how costs sneak in at the end. Let's look at how they show up every single year, and whether you have any right to question them. Operating costs and audit rights. Most tenants just look at the number, few look behind it. Operating costs get billed once a year. Unless the lease says otherwise, you're expected to accept them as is. We need to know how operating costs are documented, whether supporting invoices are available, how those costs are allocated across the property, and whether prior year adjustments can be made. We want to look for no audit rights in the lease, short or unclear audit windows, and limited access to supporting documentation. Because, of course, what we're aiming for is the right to review operating costs annually, access to those invoices and supporting detail, and a reasonable time frame to challenge. I guess you know why this matters. If you can't verify the cost, you're not managing them. You're just paying whatever shows up. You've seen the costs you can question. Now let's talk about the risks you might inherit. Environmental clauses often sound reasonable until you realize what they may include. Most leases make the tenant responsible for any contamination related to their use. The problem is that phrase isn't as clean as it sounds. What's going to matter is whether liability is tied strictly to your operations, how pre-existing conditions are handled, whether environmental reports are referenced in the lease, and what remediation looks like. What we're looking for is broad language that captures more than your use. There's no baseline environmental condition documented. And anything that says full remediation responsibility placed on you, the tenant. What we're going to aim for is liability limited to contamination caused by your operations, a baseline environmental report attached or referenced, clear separation between existing and future conditions. You shouldn't be paying to fix a problem you didn't create. You've limited your risk. Now make sure you haven't given up your position. I'm talking about renewal and extension clauses, where most tenants assume they're protected. They're not unless it's written properly. A renewal sounds simple: stay longer, keep operating. The details decide whether that's possible or costly. What's going to matter here is how many renewal options you have, the notice periods and timing, how renewal rent is determined, and whether the option survives changes to your business. Items to look for are market rent with no defined process, notice windows that are easy to miss, options tied strictly to your original legal entity, and conditions that allow the landlord to void the option. Of course, what we want to aim for is a clear method to determine renewal rent, realistic notice periods with flexibility, assignment flexibility for successor entities, enforceable options if you've performed under the lease. This might be your last guaranteed position in that building. After that, you're negotiating from scratch. You've secured your position. Now let's make sure you don't miss that opportunity sitting right next door. This is where smart tenants think ahead. Option clauses, not just about staying, but about expanding or owning when the opportunity shows up. These rights are definitely not standard. They're negotiated. What matters are rights to adjacent or upcoming space in the property, rights tied to the sale of the property, how and when those rights can be exercised. Common structures are the right of first refusal on adjacent space, right of first offer on additional space, and right of first offer to purchase the property. What you want to look for is vague language around timing or notice, rights that are easily bypassed by the landlord, and conditions that make exercising that option unrealistic. And what I am aiming for is clear notification requirements, defined timelines to respond, rights that are enforceable, not just suggestive. This matters because growth opportunities, they don't wait. If the lease doesn't give you access to them, someone else will take them. Most tenants negotiate the deal, then inherit the lease. But the lease is the deal. The rate, the size, the location, all of it sits inside a document most people skim. Leases don't create problems overnight. They create them slowly through definitions, obligations, and clauses no one challenged. If something feels unclear, that's usually where the risk is hiding. So, before you sign, ask yourself, what am I responsible for? What can I change? Where does the risk actually sit? Because the real negotiation isn't about rent, it's about control. You've built your business to last, and my job is to make sure your lease does too. If you've ever looked at a lease and thought, I think it's fine, but I'm not completely sure, that's the moment to pause. Before, not after. Subscribe, like, and follow for straight answers on the parts of commercial real estate most people push past. Most problems are not in the deal, they're in the document behind it. I'm Susan, that commercial realtor. Built for business, backed by data, negotiating with bite. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it?